I'm joined today by Stuart. Hello, Stuart.
Hi, good morning.
Now, we spoke a while ago because in September 2025, we did a special week of back to school with a kind of a focus on how do we pray? How do we support those involved in education, whether it's the school, the children, or the young people, or the students, or the teachers, or the support staff? So we were trying to look at how we can support those. And I thought it'd be great to go a little bit deeper with you. So for people who might think,
Okay.
I sort of remember him a bit, just remind us a little bit before we dig into this. What is it that you do?
Okay, so I'm a teacher. I live in the south coast of England. I've spent most of my career as a primary teacher, 21 or 2 years, and then a couple of years ago, just over a year ago, I moved into an all through school, and I'm teaching primarily in the secondary department. So it's a little bit of a change, but it's a move I've been considering for a while, and it's been really good. I'm really enjoying it, the change and the difference.
I know quite a few teachers who I've met across the years, and generally speaking, they seem to stick either primary or with secondary. How have you? Why? Well, one, why did you make that switch? And two, how is it going from much smaller people to slightly bigger people?
Um, I for some while I'd been thinking about a change. I liked most of my time in primary. I had spent teaching sort of years 5 and 6, so the upper end of primary. Although I have worked with all year groups in primary schools at different times and different capacities, but I'd always preferred working with the older year groups. And I wanted to move into secondary to get a bit more experience with those. I think that the dynamic you can have with them and the depth at which you can go into material is different. But I've been put off a little bit about the idea of going in and then just having loads of different classes. In primary, obviously, you have your class for the year. And the school where I work, they're quite innovative with their year seven. So we run it on a little bit of a primary model. So they stay with one teacher with their advisory teacher for maths, English, humanities, and then they go off to specialist teachers for other subjects. Then I teach my subject in those times as well to other year groups. So it was a really nice links. It's still got that primary feel. I've still got my class, but it was a nice step in the way that they do it here, and it works well. The children really like it as well. Helps them with the transition to secondary. So yeah, but I'm really enjoying it. It's nice being able to work with the older ones. Like I said, it's the depth that you can go into things and the types of conversations you can have in the classroom. I think is really great.
It's got to be quite a mental, almost a head sort of swishy thing going on because you're teaching everything, and then you're going to a specialty. I know there's other things that teachers do, but it's a very different approach, as you were just saying. That in primary school you're there with your class, and that those are your children. That's who you care for, and you teach them everything, maths and English and science, and but then you go to secondary where it's much more focused. What's your specialty at secondary? How have you made that mental switch from teaching everything to much more of a focus?
Well, even at primary, we nominally have a specialist subject related to the whatever degree you've done. Mine was applied theology. I went to Moorlands College, I did my degree there, and then went to Norwich to do my teacher training. So my specialism was RE. But at primary, because you are more of a generalist, it wasn't until actually the last 2 or 3 years at primary school I actually led RE as a subject in the school. I'd led all sorts of other things, but yeah. So that going into secondary then, where you are teaching that more as a specialism, it can be a little bit challenging, particularly uh, with the degree I've got, because although RE is my specialism, actually I know Christian theology pretty well. But other religions I don't know quite as well. So there's some development and things there. But it is, I think it is exciting because that's a passion and an interest of mine, being able to teach that and look at different people's worldviews and help students unpick how other people see the world, and why do people behave like this? Why do they do that? Why do they think this? To look at those, I think, is really fascinating. I can sort of have those conversations for hours. So the chance to be able to talk about it all day at school as well is great.
I was really fortunate. I was in it's actually a Church of England secondary school, and might be worth just us bearing a little bit down on how schools work in the UK because this is very much a global station. But I was at a secondary school, so that was 11 to 18 because we had a sixth form attached to the end. So you go through the first 5 years of secondary school, you stay on for your sixth form. And the real amazing blessing was there was a school across the road that was a Roman Catholic secondary school with a sixth form. So our sixth form was the joining of the Anglican and the Catholic groups. We had a Muslim, we had some Methodists, we had some Baptists, and it was a really interesting mix with Catholics and the Anglicans. So I did Christian Theology at A level, which is 16 to 18 years old, so pre-university. And some of the debates we were able to have were great. There was some passion and there was some disagreement, but actually the sort of the group of like 4 or 5 teachers that we had that shared that subject, which was the real amazing part of the shared sixth form. It was a really good way of developing, well, what do I believe, or why do I believe that? Because it's easy to know what you think, but to understand why you think it, sometimes we don't get the chance to really explore that. And that was my sort of greatest blessing, I think, of going to that school with a shared sixth form, was just developing ideas of, oh, Catholics there, that's terrible. Actually, no, maybe they're not actually, because I didn't know. And it wasn't, nasty ignorance. It was just, I don't know. So to spend time with them and think, there's quite a lot of similarity here, more than I actually ever thought was possible.
Yeah, the school I'm in is right in the middle of a town centre, literally right in the middle of the town centre. Um, and it's very diverse. We've got lots of students from different countries and different nationalities, different religions. And so actually the opportunity for them to talk about their ideas, where they're coming from, how they're seeing things. And sometimes the topics we're talking about, things they wouldn't talk about on the playground. They're just with their mates, they're with their friends. So to actually try and unpick some of these bigger ideas and understand the people around them a little better, I think is really important.
And the fascinating thing for me was we studied, I don't know, 5 or 6 modules across 2 years, one of which was communion or mass or whatever version you might want to call it, the bread and the wine. And I learned more from my Catholic teacher than I'd ever learned about it, because, of course, they're going much wider and much deeper. But they really helped me to see a reverence for it that I had never had, even though I've been to like high Anglican stuff with the school, because it was a high Anglican kind of church that was attached to us. And I'd never really learned some of the reverence and the importance and the depth from a different perspective. And that's why the cross education, if you like, was one of my greatest blessings. And one of my favorite teachers was his Catholic, nearly priest who became a teacher, because he was brilliant. He just opened the Bible in ways that I'd never had opened up to me before. And I'll be honest, I was ignorant of all sorts of stuff. I was only a teenager, but it opened my eyes, which is great.
Yeah, I think it's so good to explore what people think. We've just taught a module on for our year 8 about about the environment and why caring for the environment is important. And we explored kind of an Islamic view, which in many ways is similar. It's not exactly the same, but obviously it's similar to Christian worldview in that you have a God who's created, who's put humanity here as stewards, comparing that to a Buddhist worldview, which for people brought up in the West is a completely different way of seeing and understanding the world, and thinking about how, well, these two very different worldviews actually lead to similar sorts of conclusions about why that we should care for the environment and why, but unpicking those ideas. And the children were fascinated by it. There were so many questions that were coming out about these things. And I think it's one of those subjects as well that initially you talk about religious education to children, that they think it's not for me, doesn't affect me, I'm not interested in that. When you actually then start unpicking some of the topics and things that you can talk about, whether that be family, the environment, how we make moral decisions, all of those, suddenly this subject comes alive and people see, actually, this is really important.
And it is. There was a Muslim lad who did to some practices of Islam, but not necessarily all. He quite like his booze on a Friday night at 17. But it was really interesting in some of the conversations because he had a different perspective, and it makes you think. It was fascinating that there were some Baptists, Methodists, Anglicans, and Catholics was the biggest bulk of it all, and then there were two of us who said, "Well, we're just Christians. We wouldn't say we're any particular domination." So you've got this mishmash. People say, "I don't believe in God. I just want to know more." So it was a really, really good blend of different people, different beliefs in a room talking and thinking, okay, we can learn much from this. We can learn from each other in many, many ways. And it was really valuable. I think it's one of the reasons why today I can quite happily go into a very, what you might want to call the far end of the Pentecostal spectrum. I'm very comfortable leading worship there or worshiping, or the High Anglican Church. I can quite happily do the liturgy and reading from a book. And I'm very comfortable with both of those and anywhere in between, because actually it's different expressions of our relationship with God. We express that differently. It's the same God that we're worshiping, but we express it differently. But because of those early let's call them debates, some were heated, some were not. We're 16, 17, we're going to have opinions. But actually, because of that, I think that's one of the things that formed my ability to be so comfortable in such a massive breadth of church context.
Yeah, I think appreciation of different church traditions is important. That I've some of my views on worship and how we view the covenant and all of these different things have shifted over recent years. And actually, I've started to see in some traditions that perhaps I would once have dismissed as a little empty and shallow and whatever. I'm actually seeing, no, there is real depth here, and actually I think we've kind of got to get out of our bubbles a little bit. Yes, we can have our views and they can be strongly held at times, but let's not just dismiss each other as cranks and shallow. We're the ones who've got it right. We're the ones who have got the everything down and perfect. We're certainly not, and there's a lot to be learned from other traditions, I think.
I was very much brought up, not as a Baptist, but in the Baptist church was the biggest formative part of my life. My first full-time job in a church was an Anglican church with a really good vicar, but we had infant baptism. And that may not seem like much of a thing, but if you're a Baptist going to a church and you've got infant baptism, they are so in your head, poles apart. And I learned a lot about the value and the depth and the rich and the beauty of infant baptism. Where did it come from? Rather than, that's terrible. Well, actually, no, it's not, because there's another opinion and then there's another way of doing this. And actually, it's not going against the Bible. Therefore, actually, if it's not there, it might be okay. But unless we have those conversations and we're sort of forced into those situations, and it sounds like in some ways you've had to rediscover, I suppose, parts of your own faith. Is that sort of part of what you found?
Yes, yeah, definitely. And in fact, the issue of baptism is one of the things I've shifted on. I grew up in a Credo Baptist tradition. We weren't a Baptist church, as in not in the Baptist Union, but we practiced adult baptism. And that was kind of, if you'll pardon the pun, that was the waters I swam in all through those years, all through our formative years. Um, and then as part of my studies, I've my view on that has shifted, and I've moved to a Pado Baptist position because of how I see the covenant working and so on. And yeah, it's been really, really interesting journey over the last few years, just really thinking through some of these issues, some things that I'd taken for granted for many years and just assumed this is the way. And actually, when examining it and being challenged over some of those things and trying to put together my own view of how does this work, how do these fit together, and linking all of that in with education and my work there. What implications does this have for schooling and so on? And that's kind of what I'm trying to unpick in some of what I'm doing. But yeah, it's been a fascinating journey, and at times unsettling almost when you think, hang on a minute, the things that I took for granted, things that I took as like the firm ground, are
Yeah.
perhaps not quite as I thought they were.
I was chatting with Gareth Higgs, who is one of the professors at Moorlands College. He does coffee table theology for this radio station on a Sunday, and I was chatting with him about what it's like when students arrive at Moorlands Bible College, and he said one of the fascinating things is they have. This is me paraphrasing what he said. That there's basically these entrenched positions. They have this thing they hold and believe this is it. And he said, and then they meet somebody they think, might want to marry them, and they don't have the same opinion as me. How would that work? And it gets them to think about, well, why does this thing that's so important to me exist? How did it form? Why do I believe that? Where do I fit within what that means? And all of a sudden they're having to rediscover, well, what does that mean? And how do I fit in the world if I have that belief and they have that belief, and I quite like them, but I can't like them if they have that belief, but I don't think that's really enough reason not to like them. And it really is this sort of pressure pot of you've got to rethink about what it is that you think, and how you think it.
One of the things, I mean, I was at Moorlands a long time ago. I was there initially 95, 96 for like the foundation year, and then I went back and did the degree 1998 to 2001. I think I graduated. So it was a long time since I've been there. But one of the things I really appreciated was that mix, that it wasn't a denominational college. You had a real breadth of views. You had a real diversity of ages as well on the courses. And actually that gave a real richness. Yes, there were some tense moments in the lectures and things at times, or in fact in the student common rooms as well at times. But yeah, it was really good just to have that breadth of perspectives and ideas, and really to be forced to think, why do I hold this? Is it, and at times it confirmed you in your own beliefs, and at times it challenged, and you had to think, well, I've got to shift here a little bit. But yeah, no, it's one of the things I really appreciate about the time. There was that breadth of viewpoint.
I want to go deeper into your life, but I thought it'd be worthwhile, just because we're a global audience, going into how school works in the UK, because every country, every nationality might do it slightly differently. I think in France, you don't go into any sort of formal school until like 7 or 8 or something like that. England, UK, we're different. But how does schooling work? Can you just run us through, like, when do you start school, when do you finish school, and what are the sort of the big points for exams and stuff?
Okay, so compulsory schooling starts when a child's around 5 years old. They join reception classes, and then they're in, depending on which model, because it does change. They're then in primary school, we call it, up until they're 11 years of age. At 11 years of age, they move to secondary school, and they're there until they're 16. At the end of that, they do their GCSE exams. They can then, from GCSEs, they can then move on. They might stay on at a college and do A levels till they're 18, or they can enter other sort of vocational courses and things. But the law changed recently, and young people have to be in some sort of educational training up until 18 years of age now. So from 5 to 18 is kind of compulsory education of some sort.
Whether that's in a, I guess, a formal school setting, or you're talking about vocational. You thought like becoming a plumber or a mechanic. Is it that sort of a thing?
Yeah, so long as they're in art post 16, after 16 years of age, as long as they're in some sort of thing, that may be a vocational training. Yeah, it may be some form of college where they're studying for formal examinations. There's a whole range of different qualifications out there, from A levels to B techs to, the endless list of different things that they could be doing. But yeah, and then of course there's the alternatives. You don't have to go to state schools. Parents can pay to send children to private schools, public schools, or they can homeschool if they choose to as well. So, but most people will go start school at 5 and leave when they're 16, 18.
I went to France a couple of times through school exchanges, and the one thing that really threw me about their education system, well, there were two things. One, teachers go home when they're not teaching, which is just mind-bending for me as a 11, 13, thinking, where are they going? Oh, they're going home. They're not teaching. That's it. They haven't got to be on the premises. But the other one was the fact that there was a Renault garage on the site. And effectively, what we might see is about A-level age, 16, 18. they go to the Renault garage on the site to learn to be a mechanic very specifically.
Wow.
So when they finish the school, I mean, this is early 90s, they don't just finish with a qualification. They're actually a skilled mechanic. That was a Renault garage, obviously
Yeah.
in France. But that was quite eye-opening because I thought, well, that's really strange. And then by the end of a couple of weeks, you're thinking, that's quite clever because it's not a skill, it's a honed skill when they finish.
Yeah. Yeah. I think those things are important. There's been a move in recent decades in this country, I think, to push so many people into A levels and then university. And even as a teacher, I just don't think that's a good idea. I think ultimately it kind of devalues the degree, because everybody's got a degree. And then suddenly, then you need a master's degree to stand out. But also, I think there are so many people for whom that kind of formalized academic style of education doesn't fit them. Not not because they're not intelligent, but just there are just other things that they need to be doing. And I think particularly as Christians, we need to. There was an interesting article a while ago, a year or two back in the Evangelical Times, I think, about this, and actually really considering, is it always wise to head off to university and rack up, particularly as you do nowadays in this country, thousands, tens of thousands of pounds of debt when actually you could be going and earning a job and setting up a home and so on. And there's no easy answers and there's no right or wrong. It's very much an individual thing. But I do think as Christians we need to think much harder about what we believe about education, what it means, what's its purpose, and things. I'm doing some research at the moment. I'm studying for a professional doctorate in education. And that I'm kind of looking at this issue of how do evangelical parents view the connection between the Christian upbringing and discipleship of their children and their schooling.
Mhm.
I just think it's an area we very easily fall into. Let's just send our children off to school. They go and get their qualifications, and we don't think it through in quite the depth that we could. So I've been interviewing parents and talking to them about how they made choices about schools, those sorts of things, and how they see that connection. It's been really, really interesting to talk to them.
I had lots of teachers around me when I was at school. I don't mean in the school. I mean lots of people I knew in the church were teachers. We were sort of bereft with them. And I remember I got to the end of my A levels, and I didn't want to go to university. It was that simple. I didn't see the point. Not I don't see the point in university. For me, I thought, what am I going for? If I'm going to go and do a degree and spend 3, 4, whatever years, it's got to be because of something that has to have that.
Mhm.
In the end, I didn't do a degree. The amount of pressure was immense. And I said, but I don't want to because I don't see the point. I don't know what I'm going for to get a degree in what. I actually had points I was potentially looking at theology. For what? Why do I want a degree? Just to get a degree? What's the point in that? And
Mhm.
I got no problem people doing a degree. I think university can be great. But
Mhm.
for me, I
Yeah,
thought, but I want to go for a reason. I want it because
yeah,
that job requires a degree, right? Then I'm going to get a degree and build up to that. For me, I got married and drove trucks, and I had a great time. My wife had a degree; she's got 2 now, so I class that as my have one because there's a royal we. But I didn't know why I would want to do that. But the thing was, and this is early 90s, 95, 96, the pressure from people of, well, of course you have to go to university. How can you
yeah,
possibly survive in life without a degree? Was the attitude very much kind of middle class white Christians here in England? It's just well, we have before. University is not everything,
yeah.
but
No, no.
I didn't have the understanding of why I didn't want to go, other than, but why am I going? And I'm glad for university. Met my wife at university because she came to my church, and that's where the students went. But if I'm going to do something like that intensively for 3 or 4 years, it needed to be for a reason. For me personally, it was just I don't have the reason. I don't know what I want to do with my career. It's only when I launched a radio station 2 years ago, I thought, this is what I should be doing in my mid
Okay.
40s. I haven't sat around doing nothing. We've got a family. I drove trucks, had a great time, went some amazing experience and encounters all over the country, driving some really random stuff with police escorts, which is really good fun. And yeah, I just didn't know why I should, but the pressure to have done that was actually quite immense.
Yeah, yeah. I just don't think there should be that pressure. And I think, again, as Christians, we should be thinking really carefully, what is it we want children to get out of our education? Do we just want them to get these standard GCSE and A level qualifications so that they can go on and get some job somewhere? What is it that we should be doing, particularly in today's culture when we see increasing levels of secularization, where we see increasing laws and things that seem to conflict with our view? I'm thinking about the legalization of abortion up to birth, for home abortions, kind of do-it-yourself abortions, for um, the assisted suicide bill, all of these different things. What the Bible talks about children being like arrows, like they're kind of the weapons in our hands that we're sending into the future. We're told to go and disciple the nations, not just snatch a few individuals out here and there, but to disciple nations. What does that mean? What does that look like? How do we equip our children to do that? How do we build them up? And I think they're kind of the questions that I'm pondering. What does it look like? How do we achieve that best? Do we achieve that best through sending children to state schools? Do we achieve it best through setting up Christian schools, private Christian schools? Is that best achieved through homeschooling? And I don't think there are any hard and fast rules there, but I do think we need to give that, parents need to give that huge consideration. I think that the wider church does as well. And it's just something that's doesn't come up very often. That we've fallen into the default of our children just go to state schools. One of the things I've done in my research is kind of looking at, whenever I see a book on parenting or how to bring up children or discipling children, whether I'm in a bookshop or whatever, I flick it open and I'm looking through and going, what does it say about schools? And almost without exception, they simply don't mention schools, or there'll just be a sentence or two about them. And I think our children spend so long at school imbibing that worldview, imbibing that perspective. Is that the best education that we can give them? And like I said, I'm not judging in that sense, because I think there are so many factors that play into this. The availability of other forms of education, whether it will actually get people to the place where they need to be, whether families can afford to do those things. There are so many complicating factors, but I think it is an issue that the church and Christians need to spend more time pondering.
And if we don't, we just naturally step forwards where everybody else is stepping, which might be great and might not be God's best for us. I always think about meeting people. We're going to go on holiday. We've got the money. We're going to go on a holiday. And I remember thinking a few times, well, are you going on a holiday because you need a holiday? Is that what God's calling you to do? Or is it you've got the money, therefore you can, so therefore you don't have to think about it? And it's very easy for us not to consider some of the I suppose, mundane stuff. Going on holiday can be quite mundane. It's like you have 4 weeks mandated in law in the UK. You must have a holiday. So that's already in our heads. We have to have a holiday. What we do with it is different, of course. But I've only had a few 2-week holidays away, and that was 20 years ago or more. And I think it's easy to think, well, we've got money, therefore we should. But actually, what's God asking you to do about that? What have you thought about? That's actually where God wants you to spend your money. Or is that just what you want because of whatever reasons? Holidays can be great. We've got one recently, which is really important, and we do need to have time down. But this is I've said it to a few people. Holidays aren't biblical. It doesn't appear in the Bible, and that can be a head slap moment. But it should cause us to think, okay, well, if it's not in the Bible, but resting is, what does that look like for us? In the same way, education. It doesn't say send your kids to state school. It doesn't say keep them at home and never let them see anybody. So somewhere in between those two is a good balance for each person. But of course, if it doesn't say it, then we have to think a bit deeper.
Yeah, and I think that issue about schooling. People often say, when we say, there is no biblical mandate for state schools, people often say, well, it's because they didn't have schools then. Of course, it's not mentioned in the Bible. And there is a degree, I think, to which we are called. We see the cultural mandate in Genesis to go and subdue the earth and to develop these things. And there is a point as learning and things have developed that you might need specialist teachers for some of these areas. And so I don't think schools themselves are necessarily a bad thing, but it's the approach they take. So, but I think we have got to think, like you are with holidays, what does it mean for Christian holidays? What does it mean for Christian work? What does it mean for Christian education? Because we create this secular sacred divide. And there's a picture on it that I'm thinking of. There was just all this list of things. There was like church, family, work, education, and we kind of put this line between them. There's church here, and everything else is there, and that's kind of the sacred secular. As long as we're doing this bit, okay, everything else is, education is the same for everybody. 2+2 is 4, whether you're a Buddhist, a Muslim, an atheist, whatever. So education is but actually I think that divide should go right down the middle. There is a godly and ungodly way of doing education. There's a godly and ungodly way of going on holiday. There's and so thinking through the work of Louis Berkhoff and Cornelius Van Til really made me kind of sit up with this, because they said we talk about these, what they call brute facts. 2+2 is 4. The Battle of Hastings happened in 1066. These are just facts, and they're facts for everybody. But actually, the way that we view truth is different. What truth means for Christians is different to what truth means to an atheist or a Buddhist. And I think as well that the key thing they said was, actually there is no such thing as brute facts that are just facts by themselves, because all facts are facts because of what God has done in the universe and his providence and his creation and so on. And actually, if you forget the most important thing about those facts, which is their relationship to God and his purposes and ways, have you really understood them? Have you really had an education in them? And the analogy I use in my mind is like a car. You can study a car and you can see how the heaters work and how the engine works, and you put fuel in, and the internal combustion engine and the window wipers and the sunroof and the electric windows. You can focus on all of these things. You can learn everything there is about this car. If you miss the point that it's a mode of transport, which is the most important thing about it, have you really understood the car? And I think that's a little bit what we do with education. The education that children say, I'm not knocking. I've worked in education all my life. And I think schools do an incredible job, often in very difficult circumstances. And I think teachers work very hard. But if in a secular school, our children are getting an education that says God is not important, because there's no such thing as a neutral education. If God is not referenced, if God is not seen as the author of creation and the reason why things are as they are, whether that's in history or geography or mathematics or English or whatever it is, if we forget that connection between those subjects and their author, have we really understood them? Have we really had an education in them? Or have we had an education that says God is not relevant to these things, God is not important? And that's challenging, I think, as to what that means and to how we then work that out. And I don't know the answers to some of those questions, but I think that's kind of where my head is at with it all at the moment. What does that really mean for us as Christians in terms of what God has called us to do, to spread the gospel, to disciple the nations? How do we shape and bring our education under under God's command and under his rule. I yeah,
I guess
not so
your
quickly.
attitude is asking questions. You have some answers, but you're not quite sure is that the right answer to the right question.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but you're asking the questions, which is kind of what we want teachers to do to children is to ask the questions. You can't teach them everything, but you can teach them everything about asking a question. Ask a question. I remember
mm,
hearing a professor of education going back 15 years. I have no idea their name, but they talked about the purpose of education. If you just look at it, and he uses this example of an alien coming in, looking at the education system in England. Okay, what's the point of education? Well, you go to primary school to go to secondary school, and secondary school is a sixth form. Sixth form is A levels, therefore you can go to university, and university so you can do a PhD. And he looked at it really clinically, and he said the only purpose of a degree is sorry, the only purpose of education is to be able to go to university to get a PhD. That's the only real purpose of it because that's the linear line, and you can't get one without every other first step, and every other first step leads on to the next step, and the ultimate, effectively, is a PhD and then a professor of
mm,
education, like he was. And he said, "But what's the point of my job? I study something that changes." And it was really interesting to hear somebody who's gone through all that and said, "But what's the point? Why?
yeah,
Why?" It's that why question because great, I'm a professor of education, but no one cares unless you want to know about education from a educational point of view. So what's my value as he was asking the questions like you. If I don't have the answers, but I have questions and I want to know.
yeah, yeah. I've pondered the same thing. I mean, I'm studying for a professional doctorate in education, and I often wonder, is education even a subject? I mean, biology is an academic subject. Is education a real subject even? What am I going to have a qualification in if I ever finish this thing? What does it actually enable me to do? Well, it enables me to talk about a very tiny, narrow little bit that I've studied. But again, I'm asking myself for what purpose? And for me, I want to raise awareness of this. I want the church to think more carefully about this, and that's kind of the purpose. I don't see it necessarily as opening lots of job opportunities for me, and perhaps I'll go into academia and start. I want to speak to the church and say, look, we need to think about how we're bringing up our children and what we're doing there.
I'm clearly quite enjoying this conversation about education. Let's go to what we actually were supposed to be talking about. What's your? This is I enjoy these though. They're good. Tangents are great for my presenters. Tangents are a good thing. If we go backwards in time for you, because we've spoken
Yeah.
lots about faith, of course we have. What was your journey of faith as a child? What was your upbringing and your family? Where did faith become really meaningful to you?
Okay. So that's really interesting. For as long as I can remember, I was brought up in a Christian home. My parents were Christians, um, for as long as I can remember. However, they weren't always Christians. It was actually through my eldest brother. He was going along to one of the local churches, the youth group there, and he became a Christian. And it was through him that my parents then became Christians. Ultimately, it was that connection. So but from when I was younger, I've always just been brought up in that. Um, and I couldn't put my finger on a date and say that's when I became a Christian. And I think in many respects we have a focus on when were you converted? When did you pray the prayer? And I think actually for children, and this is one of the things I've changed my view on recently, part of my studies, I think for children brought up in Christian homes, there shouldn't necessarily be a point. It should be a natural thing. They're part of this covenant. They're brought in. It's just what they know. Yes, ultimately they have to keep to that path. They have to make that commitment. But and that's kind of how it was for me. I kind of went through school, through secondary school and I did A levels and was then thinking what I wanted to do next. And I really didn't know. There were so many different
Mm.
options. Did I want to become a paramedic? Do I want to become a doctor? Did I want to go into some sort of ministry and pastoral work or youth work? And I ended up going to Moorlands. Um, when I was there, I had um, it, it was really up and down. There were so many things going on. The experience and the things that Morelands gave me, I really value. And I'm still in contact with them now. One of the tutors there is actually one of my supervisors for my degree, my doctorate, although I'm doing that through another university. But it was a difficult time spiritually as well. It was a real time of testing. I also at that time came to terms with sexuality and same-sex attraction, and that was hard. That was hard. And after I left Morelands, I went and did my teacher training, and for a lot of years, I then walked away from the church, and I just couldn't reconcile these things. I'd worked really hard to try and find an accepting evangelical position on faith and sexuality, and ultimately just couldn't do it. And then during the pandemic, or sort of just before pandemic, I really kind of felt God calling me back again. And I think that's one of the important things I would say about faith, is this idea that for all of the times that we fail and fall away, God never lets us go. He's always got us firm. Once he's got us, we're his. And I started sort of before the pandemic, I started looking for a church, couldn't find anything where I particularly settled. And then lockdown happened, and I started watching one of the local churches online. Got involved once they unlocked again, and we were able to start meeting again. Became a member of that church. It's a Baptist church where I live. I'm not a Baptist. I kind of that's one of the things, but yeah, member of that church because I think it's a really good church. I think the teaching is sound, and since then, this has picked up with the doctorate. I'd actually started the doctorate a lot. I've been doing this a long while, and there'd been a false start. I started the research in one direction, changes at the university and the pandemic and things just meant the whole thing collapsed. And I then restarted and refocused looking at this, and just got back involved and things there. So yeah, it's been quite a journey, really. But yeah, I think the when I reflect on my faith journey, I think the key thing for me is that idea that once God's got you, he's not going to let you go. Even whatever's happening, whatever's going on, he's got you and he's faithful.
But coming back to where we started this conversation, the importance of asking the question, because it's easy to think, okay, this is what I believe. That's it. You're all wrong. And you've backed up what Gareth, one of the professors at Morelands, said. There are conversations, some of which are more energized than others, as we think about who we are, where we fit in the world. How does what we believe fit with where we think we are in the world? I went off and did a year's youth work because I did not know what to do, but I just wanted some time. If I'm going to go to university, there's got to be a reason. So I gave myself a year really to go and do some work in Manchester, which is great. And I learnt lots and realised I never want to work in children's work until God called me to that full time with my wife. So that was interesting turnaround of where I thought God was saying. But anyway, but it helped me to understand a lot of what I wanted to do. It gave me some separation distance from being at home because it was not a good home situation. So being away for a year was, oh, that's who I am. Ah, interesting. And asking the question about education. I mean, you're in education. It's got to be a really tough one to say, to effectively say, what's the point of education as a teacher of many years? But actually, unless we ask the question, we're just going to keep doing the same thing. Where some friends of ours came from Finland and they stayed with us for a while, and they were talking about education, and that one blew my world apart. Like, hang on, what? Yeah, no uniforms, because I've been indoctrinated to uniform as a king. You know they're not. You know the rich kids have nice stuff. You know the poor kids don't have nice stuff. The uniforms are in themselves not what we think they should be, and they're just not. But in Finland, there's no uniform, and it was just. That blew my mind. It's like, so you're not in the same year, so they can actually like stay together, and it just blew my mind. And Finland was one of the highest educational standards in the world. And you're thinking, well, that's interesting. And yet, of course, in the UK, it's much older in some regards in education. So we've got preparatory schools with 3-year-olds in a uniform. It's like, well, there's all these things, but unless we ask the question, what is this actually achieving, or specifically, what do we believe that God is asking us to achieve for our children? We need to ask the question, but it's got to be a hard question in education to basically say, so what's the point in what we're doing? What are we trying to achieve
Yeah,
here?
yeah. I mean, and as a Christian in education, I there are times I despair a little bit, and I see some of the things that we're supposed to teach and talk about, and the approach we're supposed to take, and I just think yeah, I fundamentally don't agree with this, and it can be really challenging. Like I said, schools I think do on the whole do a pretty good job,
Yeah.
and teachers work very hard for their students and really want the best for them. But yeah, as a Christian, you do feel at times a little bit, well, it's that idea of being aliens in the land, isn't it? And strangers in the land. This is not really where we fit. Um, and so yeah, it can be challenging, but it's good that you can be there and be salt and light, that you can bring a different perspective. Um, and I've been able to do that over some things. Like I've had conversation with the head about some material that we were supposed to use, and I said, I was kind of open that I was a Christian, but I said, even aside from that, some of the things that this is saying are just factually incorrect. Um, and the head allowed me to kind of edit the materials before it was then used in class. Um, and I think we can at times have that sway and that influence if we do it in the right way, and sort of, there's prayer and things behind us there. I think we can see positive changes, and education is a really powerful tool. I think it's so important. I can't imagine myself doing other jobs. There have been times in my career where I've absolutely despaired, and I thought, why am I doing this? And some while ago, I even reduced my hours. I went part-time for you, and I was teaching 2 days a week on my contract, and the other 3 days a week I was trying to set up my own little business to do with first aid, which is another interest of mine. And I gave it up in the end. I went back into education full time, and I just can't imagine myself doing this, because it is so important what we are doing. That the lives of these young people. I beside being a parent, I can't really see a more important job in that sense, because yeah, we have such influence over the lives of children, how they think and how they see the world, and what we can give them in terms of qualifications, and what we can give them in terms of knowledge and thinking and so on. It's just, yeah, it's an awesome responsibility, but it's a good one. I can't see myself doing anything else at the moment.
And we thank you for it, because teachers are often forgotten about, pushed aside until we need them, and doing a great job of bringing up the bulk of young people in
Mm.
the UK. So thank you for what you're doing, because it does make a difference. I've worked in schools, and not full time, and I went in and doing assemblies and stuff. But you just see some of the load and the strain of the child that's just come in a real mess, and who's picking that up? Well, it's the teachers who've got a class of
Yeah,
35 kids, whatever, waiting, and they have to wait. And there's all these pressures that are pulling you in 100 ways at once, and you're thinking, I've only got 2 hands. You can't pull me that many directions. Something is going to rip, and yet they still keep going
yeah,
and doing what you're doing. So I love the fact that you've had that big question. But again, you asked the question, should I be a teacher? Effectively is your question. Do I want to do this for the rest of my life? And you've gone out and you've researched, you've done something and said, actually, yes, I do want to go back to teaching full time. And a lot of people
yeah,
wouldn't even try that. So it's good that you've tried to think, well, is there something else within the interest you have in first aid? And realize, this teaching thing, this is really important. But again, I need to wrap this up because I'm enjoying this too much. If we don't ask the question, we're just going to keep repeating it and not knowing if what we're doing is really any good, is there any purpose and any value. And I think
yeah,
the question you're asking is really valid, because what is school for? What's the purpose?
Yeah.
When you remember that the education system in the UK was made by the church, okay, the government took it
Yes.
over.
Yeah.
When you understand the
Yeah.
history of how it actually came to be, like
Yeah.
hospitals, like probation service, it's all come from the church originally. Okay, so it's changed and morphed massively. But the church created the need of education being delivered in a really better, more uniform way. And they created the British education system as we know it. That's
Yeah.
morphed. But that's what the church made. So we can do some amazing things as
Yeah.
church, but we are really creators. We are the original influencers, if you like. And we need
Yeah.
more of that, which is why I'm glad you're asking
Yeah.
the questions that I think many wouldn't
Yeah.
want to consider allowing themselves or anybody else to question.
I think that's the thing. I think question everything, and don't be frightened of asking questions. We think there are some things that we perhaps shouldn't question, or we just take, or other things we just take for granted. But I think question it, question it. Just go back to the Bible, pray about it, talk to others, read about it, but just question, what is God asking you to do in the field of education with your children, within the church, whatever, because it is the children we have are such a precious gift. We need to look after them as absolutely as well as we can and to the best of our ability. And we, yeah, ask questions. Are we doing the right thing? Is there something else we should be doing, or is this what God is asking us to do?
Stuart, thank you. I have to round it off, otherwise we'll run out of time. But education matters, and asking questions about question that matters as well. So I hope your research goes well as you continue to ask those questions. But I was going to set this interview in any way, it would be ask the questions, even the difficult ones.
Yeah. Yes. Ask God and trust God, because like I said, he's got you. We're in his hands. So it's a good place to be to ask questions from.
Amen. Stuart, thank you.
Thank you.